Welcome back to the course on International Financial Management. Till now, we have discussed about transaction and translation risk. And today, we will learn about country risk that every firm that operates across borders faces. In a world where each country operates under its own political system, economic conditions, and regulatory framework, country risk is an unavoidable reality in cross border business. By the end of today's lecture, we will have a comprehensive understanding of what country risk is, what its four distinct types are, how the economic health of a country signals its risk level, and what tools and techniques are available to assess it systematically. Let us begin. When a firm invests domestically, say an Indian company setting up a factory in Gujarat, it operates within a single familiar environment. One set of laws, one currency, one tax systems, one regulatory regime. The political system, with whatever flaws it has, is known and is navigable. The risks are real, but they are familiar. Now consider the same firm deciding to set up a subsidiary in politically volatile country in Africa or to lend money to a company operating in Latin America or to acquire a business in Southeast Asia. Now suddenly the firm steps into an entirely different environment. An environment it may not fully understand, an environment that can change quickly and unpredictably, and the environment in which the rules of the games may shift, not because the firm did anything wrong, but because a government changed, a policy reversed, or a crisis hit. This is the essence of country risk. And here is the most important thing to understand. Country risk is not about whether the project itself is commercially viable. The factory may be efficient, the product may be in demand, the management team may be excellent. Instead, country risk asks a different question entirely. Will the political and economic environment of the host country support or weaken a fundamentally sound business? With that context in mind, let us now formally define country risk. Country risk refers to the risk of investing or lending in a country arising from possible changes in the business environment that may adversely affect operating profits or the value of assets in the country. There are four types of country risk. These are macro political risk, ownership control risk, operating risk, and transfer risk. Before we go through each one, I want to make one important point. These four types are not mutually exclusive. A country experiencing severe political turmoil may simultaneously expose a foreign firms to all four types of risk at once. But by conceptually distinguishing them, we give ourselves a structured way to think about where exactly the firm's exposure lies and therefore how to manage it. Let us go through each type in turn. The first type is macro political risk. Macro political risk refers to broad country-wide political instability that affects all foreign firms operating in a country. The keyword here is all. This is not a risk that is targeted at a specific company or a specific industry. It is country level risk arising from a general political environment but touches every firm operating within that country's border. Now let's understand the specific factors that analysts look at assessing when macro political risk arise. First, we have government stability. This looks like at the likelihood of the ruling party or the ruling government remaining in power. If a government is facing credible crisis or there is no clear system for leadership change, the political risk is higher than in a stable and well established administration. Then, the internal conflict, such as civil war, insurgency, ethnic or religious violence, are the most visible and disruptive forms of macro political risk because they directly disrupt physical operations, supply chains, and the safety of employees. The external conflict includes like wars, border disputes, or military tensions with the neighboring countries. Now, democratic accountability talks about whether government can be peacefully removed through elections and institutional process. And now finally we have this terrorism risk, which is formally assessed through a global terrorism index. The Global Terrorism Index is a structured tool used to assess the risk of terrorism within a country or against its interest abroad over the next 12 months. Its credibility lies in its multidimensional approach, evaluating five key factors: motivation, presence, scale, efficacy, and prevention. The example on this slide brings macro political risk into the present day. When Russia invaded Ukraine in Feb 2022, foreign firms faced an overnight transformation of their operating environment. The response was extraordinary in greater scale. Over 300 major international businesses announced their exit within weeks, and over 1,000 had left by May 2022. Leaving the business like this was a costly affair. Companies with physical assets like factories and equipments faced a tough choice. If they stayed, they risked damage to their reputation and regulatory trouble, and if they left, they had to give up their investments and could even lose their assets to Russian authorities. This is macro political risk in its most vivid modern form. The firm had done nothing wrong. The political environment of the host country collapsed around them, and every foreign firm, regardless of industry or size, was caught in the fallout. The second type of country risk is the ownership or control risk. Ownership and control risk means the risk that a government in another country may interfere or even take over a foreign company's assets or operations. This is the most serious types of political risk because it doesn't just make doing business difficult, it can take away what the company has already built. Ownership and control risk is not just two extremes. It can range from small government interference to full takeover. At the milder end, a government may simply impose increased regulation, or it can new rules or new compliance requirements, or there can be new restrictions on how the firm can operate. Moving along this spectrum, a government may require the MNC to take on a forced local partner, diluting the firm's ownership stake and control over its operations. Further along, we encounter what is known as creeping expropriation, which is a gradual, incremental erosion of firms' rights and values through escalating taxes, regulatory discrimination, and restrictions without a single dramatic act of seizure. Then we have nationalization, where the government takes over the firm, typically offering some compensation, but on terms that firm may not accept as fair or adequate. And at the extreme end, which is outright expropriation, the government seizes assets with minimal or no compensation whatsoever. To understand how ownership and control risk plays out in practice, there is no better case than Venezuela's oil industry. Venezuela offers one of the most extensively documented modern example of this risk materializing not once but repeatedly and the consequences for the foreign firms have been severe and long lasting. In 2007, President Hugo Chavez transferred operating control of Venezuelan oil fields from international oil companies to the state owned conglomerate, which was PDVSA. In 2010, the Venezuelan government went even further by taking over the equipment of a US oil services company and a Spanish agricultural firm. These were not large oil giants but smaller businesses, showing that no foreign company was completely safe. In the 2018, 10 years after 2007 nationalization, ConocoPhillips won a $2 billion arbitration case against PDVSA through the International Chamber of Commerce. The Venezuela case teaches us something that goes beyond the expropriation itself. The case clearly shows winning legally does not guarantee actual payment. ConocoPhillips continued pursuing payment long after its assets were nationalized, even winning multi-billion-dollar arbitration awards years later. More importantly, even if a company wins in court, actually receiving the money depends on the country's ability and willingness to pay. A government that cannot or refuses to pay creates a completely different level of risk. Venezuelan government and its state oil company PDVSA were actually struggling financially, and still they have not paid the full amount yet. The third type of country risk is the operating risk. Operating risk is subtler than ownership and control risk. It refers to the risk that a host country government's policies, regulations, or actions will interfere with the day to day operations of the foreign firm. The key distinction from ownership or control risk is this: operating risk does not threaten the firm's ownership of its assets. The firm retains ownership, but the government makes it progressively harder, more costly, or less profitable to actually operate. India's 2012 tax change is a clear example of operating risk caused by the changing rules. The government tried to tax Vodafone for its 2007 deal to buy Hudson's India's business, many years after the deal had already happened under the rules at that time. This created a lot of uncertainty. If a deal that was legal earlier could be taxed later by applying a new rule to the past, investors began to doubt how stable India's tax system was. This discouraged foreign investment for years until the rule was removed in 2021. Now, this is operating risk. It is not a takeover or a war, but a sudden rule change that can shake investors' confidence just as much. The fourth and the final type of country risk is the transfer risk. Transfer risk is the risk arising from a decision by a foreign government to restrict capital movements, making it difficult or impossible for a subsidiary company in host country to send back profits to its parent company. They are not able to send back interest or even capital. What makes transfer risk particularly significant is that it can occur even when the subsidiary is operating profitably. Let's see how broad transfer restrictions can be. Firstly, profit repatriation restrictions mean that even though the subsidiary is profitable, it cannot transfer those profits to the parent company. Then the dividend payments can be blocked, preventing the parent from receiving the return on its equity investment. This is a direct hit to shareholders' value. Next, the intercompany loan repayments can be restricted. Now, this prevents the subsidiary from repaying money it has borrowed from the parent company. This effectively means the parent has made a loan it cannot recover. And finally, capital repatriation. The original investment itself can be frozen. In the most extreme cases, a firm cannot exit a country and bring back the capital it's originally invested, even if it wants to shut down and walk away. For a recent example of transfer risk, we turn to Nigeria between 2022 and 2024. Emirates Airlines suspended its flights to Nigeria in late 2022, not due to safety concerns or low demand, but because it had $85 million in revenue trapped in Nigerian banks' accounts and it could not be repatriated. Cumulatively, global airlines had over $800 million stuck in Nigeria at the time. GSK, Procter and Gamble and several other multinationals eventually exited the country entirely, not because their businesses failed, but because their profits could not be moved out. This is the essence of transfer risk. The business works, the revenues are earned, but the country's foreign exchange regime makes those earnings inaccessible to the parent. So far, we have discussed country risk primarily through the lens of political risk. The four types of political driven threats to a foreign firm's operations and assets. But country risk has an equally important economic dimension. Beyond politics, macroeconomic conditions of the host country directly determines how hospitable or hostile the environment will be for a foreign investor. A country may have a perfectly stable political system, but if its economy is in chronic state of mismanagement with high inflation, unsustainable fiscal deficits and a rigid exchange rate, the foreign firm's investment will be at risk, not from the political action, but from economic decline. So, how do we read a country's economic health? Now, what signals tell us whether a country's macroeconomic environment is conducive to investment or whether it poses unacceptable risk? This table gives us clear side by side pictures of what separates a healthy economy from an unhealthy one from a country's risk perspective. On the left hand, we have the warning signals of an unhealthy economy. And what are they? They are large fiscal deficit, high inflation, price controls, fixed exchange rates, inefficient production, wasteful government spending, and unpredictable taxes. Some of these signals that the government has lost control over its economy. And that loss of control becomes the foreign firm's problem. On the right are the markers of sound investment friendly environment. And what are they? They are free markets, flexible exchange rates, open economy, minimal and predictable regulation, and transparent fiscal management. We have now established what country risk is and what its key dimensions are. Now, what is the next natural question that we can have? It is, how do we actually assess it or measure it? Assessing country risk is not a precise science. There is no single formula that takes a set of inputs and produce a definite reliable country risk score. It requires combining quantitative data with the qualitative judgment and using multiple approaches, each of which captures a different aspect of the risk picture. International investors and MNCs typically use a combination of four techniques. Let us go through each one. The first technique is quantitative analysis. Quantitative techniques apply statistical methods to historical data to model the relationship between countries' risk factors and measurable outcomes, such as sovereign default rates, capital outflow volumes, and exchange rate volatility, etc. The fundamental idea is that the past contains information about the future. If we can identify which economic and political variable have historically predicted adverse outcomes in a country or across a sample of similar countries, we can use those variables to estimate risk level of any given country today. The process works as follows. Historical data is collected on a set of economic and political variables, things like inflation rate, fiscal deficits as a percentage of GDP, current account balances, political stability indices, and so on. A statistical model is then built that estimates how changes in these variables are historically associated with changes in the outcome of interest. Say the probability of debt default or the magnitude of currency depreciation. Once the model is estimated, it can be used for two purposes. First, it can assess the risk level of a country based on today's values of the predictor variables. Second, it can be used for scenario analysis. What is scenario analysis? It is like asking questions like what happens to my expected returns if inflation doubles? What if the fiscal deficit widens by 3% points of GDP? These are the kinds of stress tests that a risk conscious MNC or a lender would want to run before committing capital. The second technique is the Delphi technique, a structured method for gathering and aggregating expert opinions. Rather than relying on historical data and statistical models, the Delphi technique reorganizes that experienced practitioners such as political analyst, country economist, and regional specialist. Now, these people often hold insights that are not captured in any data. They have a deep knowledge of country's political dynamics, its cultural context, and the institutional quality that regression models simply cannot replicate. The Delphi techniques works through a series of steps. First, a panel of independent experts is assembled. Each expert provides their risk assessment independently, that is, without knowing what the others have said. This is important because it avoids anchoring bias. Now, what is this anchoring bias? It is when a strong opinion influences everyone else and people stop thinking independently. So, this bias is removed through independent risk assessment without knowing what the others are saying. The second is the independent assessment are then aggregated, typically averaged, and the degree of dispersion, that is the variability across experts, is measured. High dispersion is itself informative. It signals that even the experts genuinely disagree, which is a signal of deep uncertainty about the country in question. In some versions of these Delphi techniques, what happens is the aggregated results are fed back to the experts. That means they are sent back to the experts. These are the compiled reports. Now, these experts are then given the opportunity to revise their assessment. Now, this creates a repetitive process until the convergence is seen. So, this as it is creating an iterative process that converges towards a informed collective view, you can genuinely reach a conclusion. The third technique is perhaps the most straightforward, most simple, and arguably the most undervalued. Now, this technique is the inspection visit. Inspection visits involve traveling to the country in question and meeting directly with key stakeholders to assess the reality of the operating environment firsthand, rather than through mediation or through data, models, or second-hand report. The table on this slide captures the key stakeholders that a firm would typically meet during the inspection visit. For example, the government officials provide insights into the policy intentions. It tells us what the government's attitudes towards foreign investment is, where the regulatory change is heading, or what is going to be the next step, and what the government's priorities are. These conversations are highly illuminating and sometimes alarming. Then comes the local and foreign firms executives. They offer perhaps the most valuable information of all, which is real, practical, lived experience of operating in the country. What are the actual challenges? What does corruption look like in practices? How do you deal with the local bureaucracy? The local business community and the consumers, they are also very important as they provide picture of demand conditions, market sentiments, and purchasing power. This is the commercial side of the risk assessment. Next comes the local legal and financial advisors. They clarify the regulatory environment, the reliability of contract enforcement, and the practical operations of the legal system, which on paper may be look adequate but in practice may be slow, partial, or susceptible to political influence. The fourth technique is the qualitative analysis, the use of subjective, non numerical assessment of risk, drawing on expert commentary, political intelligence, and market signals that are difficult or impossible to quantify. Some of the most important signals of the country risk are not captured in any dataset. A breaking news story about a surprise election result or a rumor of capital controls, they can be an example. These are qualitative signals, and ignoring them in favor of numbers alone can be dangerous. The key sources of qualitative intelligence for a country risk assessment include financial publications, news aggregators, think tanks and research bodies, credit rating agencies' commentary. While the four techniques we have discussed represent different methods of gathering intelligence, firms and investors also need a structured way to organize and aggregate that intelligence into an overall country risk assessment. And this is where the checklist approach comes into picture. The checklist approach is the most systematic framework for country risk assessment. It works by identifying all the relevant risk factors, rating each factor on a defined numerical scale, assigning a weight to each factor based on its relative importance, and then aggregating the weighted scores into a single composite number. The composite scores allow countries to be compared directly with one another. The most widely used is the International Country Risk Guide ICRG, published by Political Risk Services or PRS Group. The ICRG assesses countries' risk across three distinct dimensions: political risk, financial risk, and economic risk. Political risk carries the highest weight, a maximum of 100 points, reflecting the judgment that political instability is the most fundamental and pervasive source of country risk. Different components assessed include government stability, socioeconomic conditions, internal and external conflict, corruption, the role of military in politics, democratic accountability, and bureaucracy quality. Together, these components provide a comprehensive picture of the political and governance environment. Now, financial risk is scored out of a maximum 50 points. It focuses on the country's external financial position, that is, how much foreign debt it carries relative to its GDP, how manageable its debt service obligations are, the health of its current account, the adequacy of its foreign exchange reserve, and the stability of its exchange rate. Then comes the economic risk. Economic risk is also scored out of 50 points, covering the fundamentals of domestic economic performance, which are GDP per capita, real GDP growth, inflation, the fiscal balance, and the current account balance. The total maximum score across all three categories is 200 points, and the key principle is a higher ICRG means lower risk. Countries with scores near 200 are considered very low risk. Countries with score near 0 are extremely high risk. Now, if we see here, even in this political risk having a maximum point of 100, we have divided this 100 among the various variables. For example, the government stability is given 12, socio-economic condition given 12, followed by investment profile, internal conflict, and external conflict, while the bureaucracy quality is given 4, which is the least score. And here in this also financial risk, each and every variable in financial risk is given different score. And the foreign debt as percentage of GDP is 10, and country current account as percentage of GDP is 15, which is the highest. Now, a country is going to be scored on the basis of these variables, and the maximum score that can be given to a country is these. Fine. For example, a country A might be given 6 out of 12 in government stability, right? Or it might be given exchange rate stability, which is 10 here, the maximum score is 10 here. It might be given 8 out of 10. So, similarly, we are going to aggregate all these scores given to that particular country, and we will find out that what is the maximum score the country is obtains from the assessment. Now, once there can be another way also in which we have certain factors, like I have given this economic risk factors and the political risk factors. These are the factors that we want to study about the country, and these factors are attitude of the host government, conflict, and the corruption, right? Corruption. We have given the rating to all these factors out of 5. Fine. So, the attitude of the host government is given 3, the conflict is 2 out of 5, and the corruption is 4.35 out of 5. Now, we have given weights to these factors. Say 35% weightage we have given for the attitude of the host government, 35 weightage to the conflict, and 30% to the corruption. Now, we will multiply with these weights with the score, and then we will reach a total score of 3.06. We will add these products and we will reach this score. Similarly, for the economic risk factor, we are again rating it out of 5. We have given full number for gross national income per capita, which is 5. FDI potential has been given 4.67, and inflation rates are 3 out of 5. Now we will multiply these with the weights given, which are 30%, 35% and 35% respectively. We have we will get the product of it, add all these, and what do we get? 4.18 score for the economic risk score. So the economic risk score is better than the political risk score in this case. With the individual risk category scores in hands, we now combine them into an overall country risk. Political risk is assigned a weight of 60% and economic risk is assigned a weight of 40%. The overall composite country risk score is now 3.51. Now, what does this number tell us? First, the weighting reflects a deliberate judgment. Political instability is treated as a more fundamental threat than economic weakness, which is why it carries a higher rate, and that is 60%. Second, a lower score signals high risk. A higher score signals a more investment friendly environment. How the score of 3.51 is interpreted depends on the scale being used and how it compares to other countries in the firm's investment universe. In practice, the absolute number matters less than where it sits relatively to peers. The next major country risk assessment tool, and in many ways the most publicly visible, is the sovereign credit rating issued by major international credit rating agencies. While the ICRG provides a detailed, multi-dimensional analytic framework, sovereign ratings distill countries' risk into a single letter grade that is immediately interpretable by investors, lenders, and financial markets worldwide. A sovereign rating is a credit rating assigned to a country, a sovereign by a rating agency, reflecting that country's ability and willingness to meet its financial obligations to foreign investors and creditors. The three agencies that dominate sovereign credit rating and whose ratings are most widely watched by global capital markets are Moody's, Standards and Poor's, and Fitch, with their highest ratings being AAA for Moody's and AAA for both S&P and Fitch, indicating the lowest credit risk, and their lowest ratings indicating default or near default. The final assessment tool will examine today is the Foreign Investment Risk Matrix, or FIRM. The firm takes a different approach from ICRG numerical scoring and the rating agency's letter grade. Instead of producing a single composite score, it visualizes countries' risk on two-dimensional matrix, allowing a firm to position countries relative to one another on two dimensions simultaneously. The matrix has two axes. The horizontal axis measures financial and economic risk, ranging from unacceptable to the left to acceptable on the right. The vertical axis measures political risk, ranging from unstable at the bottom to stable at the top. The combination of these two axes creates three distinct investment zones. These are the acceptable zones, which occupies the upper right of the matrix, where political risk is low, that is stable, and the financial risk is acceptable. Countries in these zones are suitable for investment. The unacceptable zone occupies the lower left, where political risk is high, unstable, and financial risk is also unacceptable. Countries in this zone should be avoided. And between the two extremes is what is called the unclear or uncertain zone. Countries with mixed profiles where one dimension is acceptable but the other is not, or where both are in borderline. These countries require further, more detailed analysis before an investment decisions can be made. Let us look at how actual countries are positioned on the firm matrix using the real world examples. Now, let us keep these countries in the graph that has been given to us. Now, this is financial risk rating. That means here it is very poor. we can say the rating is poor because it is unacceptable, and here the rating is very good because it is acceptable, right? This side. And here we have a unstable political risk, that means the risk is very high here, and here the risk is low. So we are talking about risk here, right? So in the unacceptable zone we have Russia right now, and in the acceptable zone we have UK. Now if we talk about Poland and Brazil, it is in the unclear zone, where if we are actually not clear whether we have to invest here or not. We are 100% clear that we should not invest here, and we are 100% clear that we should invest in UK. But here we need, for Poland and Brazil, that is under this red area, we need more data in order to arrive at the conclusion whether we have to invest more or not. Now, the firm does not give a precise score. It is not that kind of tool. What it does gives you is an immediate intuitive sense of where a country stands relative to its peer and which zone of the risk spectrum it occupies. For a firm evaluating multiple potential investment destinations simultaneously, the firm's matrix provides a powerful first filter. Let's conclude this lecture. We defined country risk and explored its two broad dimensions. We worked through the four types: macro political risk, ownership and control risk, operating risk, and transfer risk. We examined how a country's macroeconomic health signals at its risk level, and we covered the four assessment techniques and the three major rating tools, that is, the ICRG, sovereign ratings, and the firm matrix. In the next lecture, we will complete a discussion on country risk by looking at how firms actually manage and mitigate it, both before and after investing. Thank you. See you in the next lecture.